If you've been around games long enough, you've probably felt it. This quiet shift where the games everyone is talking about aren't always the giant blockbuster AAA titles anymore. More and more, it's the weird little indie games on Steam, that surprise hit on Game Pass, or the passion project from a tiny team that suddenly takes over your timeline. Today, we're going to walk through how we got here, what the numbers actually say, and the real pros and cons of both indie and AAA games today. Let's rewind. Back in the early 2000s, the idea of an indie game was almost underground. Distribution was boxed copies in a store, marketing was TV ads and magazine spreads, and the only studios that could really compete were the ones backed by big publishers. If you didn't have a physical publisher, you basically didn't exist. Suddenly, you didn't need shelf space on Walmart to reach players. You just needed a digital storefront and a download button. This is where the indie games started to breathe. On Xbox Live Arcade, games like Braid, Castle Crashers, and Super Meat Boy showed that small teams could deliver a tight, memorable experience that stood toe-to-toe with the big budget titles in terms of impact, if not raw production value. On PC, Steam slowly opened the gates to more and more independent releases. But the real explosion came in the 2010s. Game engines like Unity and Unreal Engine became accessible, affordable, and well documented. You didn't need to build your own engine from scratch anymore. A small team, or even a solo dev, could ship something that looked and felt professional. At the same time, YouTube and Twitch gave indie games something they never had before: free, viral marketing. A single streamer picking up a quirky indie game could do more for that game's visibility than a traditional ad campaign. Think about titles like Among Us, Hades, Stardew Valley, Celeste, Slay the Spire. These weren't massive AAA productions, but they dominated conversation, fan art, and streaming platforms. Now let's fast forward to the mid-2020s where we can actually look at the hard numbers. According to the Global Indie Games Market Report 2024, indie games on Steam are now making as much money as AA and AAA games combined on their platform, with indie revenue shares doubling since 2018. Another breakdown of the same data shows that in 2024, indie games generated nearly $4 billion in gross revenue on Steam from January through September alone, about a 48% of full game revenue on the platform. In other words, on Steam, indies aren't just the little guys anymore, they're almost half the business. And it's not just revenue, it's volume. In 2015, around 1,951 indie games were released on Steam. By 2024, that number had jumped to 8,554. That's more than a 4 times increase in less than a decade. The indie market itself is valued at around $4.85 billion in 2025, with projections to reach $9.55 billion by 2030. Growing at a 14.5% compound annual growth rate. So when people say indies are rising, it's not just vibes, it's backed by data. Now let's talk about why this is happening. There are a few big forces pushing indie games up. First, free distribution. Steam, Epic, itch.io, console storefronts, these platforms remove the gatekeeping of physical retail. A small team can launch globally with a fraction of the cost it used to take. Second, accessible tools. Engines like Unity and Unreal, plus asset stores, tutorials, and online communities have lowered the barrier to entry. You don't need a 100-person team to build something beautiful anymore. Third, streaming and social media. Indie games are often highly watchable. They're surprising, they're weird, they're emotional, and they're easy to share. A single viral clip on TikTok or a big streamer picking up the game can catapult an unknown title into the spotlight overnight. Recent analysis show indie games now compete directly with AAA titles on live streaming platforms, with some indies briefly matching or surpassing AAA visibility during peak moments. Fourth, player fatigue with AAA formulas. A lot of AAA games have drifted towards similar patterns: open worlds, battle passes, live service grinds, and monetization layers. Players who want something fresh, focused, or experimental often find that in indie games. But to really understand the rise of indie versus AAA, we need to look at the pros and cons of each, not just from a player perspective, but from a creative and business standpoint. Let's start with AAA games. Pros. Spectacle and production value. AAA games brings the big guns. Cutting-edge graphics, impressive soundtracks, motion capture, huge cinematic set pieces. If you want that playable blockbuster movie feeling, AAA is where it lives. Scale and content volume. Large teams can build massive worlds, long campaigns, and deep systems. You get hundreds of hours of content, fully voiced characters, and huge multiplayer ecosystems. Marketing reach. AAA games have the budget to dominate the conversation. Trailers at major events, billboards, cross promotions, celebrity tie-ins, they can reach the players who don't even follow gaming news. Technical polish, at least in theory. With big Q&A teams and large budgets, AAA games aim for the highest baseline of stability and accessibility across platforms, even if they always don't hit it. Cons. Risk aversion. When a game costs hundreds of millions of dollars to make and market, publishers get conservative. That's why we see so many sequels, reboots, and familiar formulas. Innovation happens, but it's often incremental. Monetization pressure. Live service models, microtransactions, battle passes, cosmetics, boosters. AAA games are often built around long-term monetization that can create friction between design and fun. Long development cycles. Big games can take 5, 6, 7 years to ship. By the time they arrive, trends may have shifted and expectations are high. Crunch and studio instability. We've seen repeated reports of crunch, layoffs, and studio closures around AAA projects. The stakes are so high that a single flop can put a studio at risk. Now let's flip it and look at indie games. Pros. Creative freedom. Indie teams can take risks. They can build a game about running a cozy farm, managing a paper, exploring grief, or playing as a sediment piece of bread. There's no boardroom demanding a battle pass. Focused experiences. Indies often pick one or two core ideas and polish them hard. You might get tight, memorable experiments that respect your time. Roguelikes, puzzle games, narrative adventures, deck builders, and more. Faster iteration. Smaller teams can pivot quickly. They can respond to feedback, patch rapidly, and experiment with mechanics without needing to move a giant organization. Emotional and thematic range. Indies frequently tackle topics AAA won't touch: mental health, identity, small human stories, experimental storytelling. They can be deeply personal. Lower price points. Many indie games launch at a lower price than AAA titles, making them an easier impulse buy and easier recommendations. Cons. Discoverability. That same report that shows the indie revenue rising also shows the sheer volume of releases. Thousands of indie games launch every year. Most of them never break through the noise. Limited resources. Small teams means limited Q&A, fewer platforms at launch, and sometimes rough edges. Not every indie can afford full localization, accessibility features, or long-term support. Financial risk for creators. Behind every breakout success are countless indie projects that never recoup their costs. For developers, the indie dream can be a financial brutality. Inconsistent quality. Because the barrier to entry is so low, quality varies wildly. For every polished gem, there are many unfinished or unrefined products. So where does this leave us? Right now, we're in a hybrid era. On one side, AAA games still dominate the top of the charts, especially in genres like big budget shooters, sports games, and massive open world RPGs. They're not going anywhere. They still drive hardware sales, subscription services, and big cultural moments. On the other side, indie games have carved out a permanent, powerful lane. They're not just cut-side projects anymore. They're a major economic force and a creative engine for the entire industry. On platforms like Steam, they're now responsible for nearly half of the full game revenue, and their market is projected to almost double in just a few years. And here's the interesting part. The line between indie and AAA is getting blurry. We're seeing AA and Indie Plus games, projects with indie roots but bigger budgets. sometimes backed by publishers who specialize in supporting smaller teams. Games like Palworld and Mana Lords show that a small or mid-sized team can deliver something with massive reach and production value, especially when paired with smart marketing and a strong systems design. We're also seeing AAA studios borrow ideas from indies, roguelike modes, cozy side content, stylized art, and more experimental storytelling. Meanwhile, indie devs are using high-end tools and pipelines that used to be reserved for the big studios. In a way, the rise of indie games hasn't killed AAA, it's pressured it to evolve. Players now expect more variety, more creativity, and more respect for their time. If a AAA game feels bloated, grindy, or over-monetized, there's always a tight, clever indie experience waiting in the backlog. From a player's perspective, this is one of the best times in history to be into games. You can bounce from a massive cinematic AAA release to a 5-hour emotional indie story, then to a weird experimental roguelike, then to a cozy life sim, all in the same month. From a creator's perspective, it's both exciting and terrifying. The tools and platforms are there, the audience is there, but so is the competition. So, to wrap it all up, timeline-wise, indie games went from a niche and hard to distribute in the early 2000s to digitally empowered in the late 2000s to explosively visible in the 2010s to an economically competitive with the AAA on platforms like Steam by the mid-2020s. Stat-wise, indie revenue share on Steam has roughly doubled since 2018, reaching about 48% of full game revenue and nearly $4 billion in 2024 alone, with the broader indie market projected to almost double in value by 2030. Pros and con-wise, AAA brings scale, spectacle, and reach, but struggles with risk aversion and monetization pressure. Indie brings creativity, focus, and emotional range, but faces discoverability and resource challenges. The rise of indie games isn't a story of one side winning over the other. It's a story of balance shifting. AAA still builds the giant tentpoles, indie fills in the gaps with heart, weirdness, and experimentation. And together, they're shaping a landscape where players have more choice, more variety, and more personality in their games than ever before. That's the real win.